Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week, claims of a breakthrough treatment for osteoporosis that could theoretically reverse what we're observing. There are concerns that the bacteria in your mouth could actually be the cause of giving you a heart attack, although we are rather skeptical about this. Daylight savings could be a major cause of health harm for millions of Americans. A bizarre snail that not only lives in an incredibly inhospitable environment, but makes use of iron in its shell. And the IgNobel prizes have been awarded for 2025. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. We'll start with the research on osteoporosis and theoretically stopping it, if not outright reversing it. The research comes from the University of Leipzig and Shandong University in China. What they found is that there is a specific cell receptor, GPR133. It also goes under the receptor name ADG-RD1, and what this does is tell the cells, called osteoblasts, that are involved in building up bones, to become active and do just that. This is rather obviously important, given that the whole thing with osteoporosis is that bone density and bone buildup decreases with age. There are fewer osteoblasts and there is fewer instruction for them to do anything, therefore they stop working as much. They're kind of like, let's say, public servants. They stand around and do absolutely nothing most of the time, or even on a construction site. Perhaps a more apt metaphor, let's say. And particularly as they get older. And so, looking at a chemical called AP503, they're able to, using AP503, they're able to get the osteoblasts to build up bone density, even if the gene, GPR133, isn't present. And that means they've had a knockdown model with their mice where they've basically prevented it from being active in any way, shape or form, or completely removed it from the gene sequence. Then they've given this chemical, effectively what would become a drug, and bone density improved. All of this sounds kind of great, and the way they were able to discover it is slightly more promising as well, in that they used a computer to run a program that would screen a variety of different compounds they had access to simulate what happens as you go through these different drugs, and they found these are possible candidates. The candidates obviously found one match, which is actually better than we expected. Typically speaking, this kind of research is throwing enough mud at the wall to see what sticks, and often not much sticks, if anything at all. Of course, remembering that this is all done in an animal model, and specifically in rodents, and so, well, transferring or translating research from an animal model to humans is a very optimistic exercise. This kind of research basically requires you have the sunniest of dispositions, and you would never survive in this field if you were any kind of pessimist, let's say. As a result, at least for now, theoretically it works. In another study that's somewhat surprising, and this time more so for what it is and how it is than anything else. It's a clinical trial claiming that you can give an oral medication in the form of semaglutide, ozempic, Wegovy, anything like that, and provide it as an oral medication rather than an injected medication, and it still works. There is a very solid and very good reason why we don't provide things like insulin and other similar products as a oral medication. It will not survive the stomach.
You're not going to get dinner started. She's going to tell that sloppy old Spanish maid to do it. And she will, but only because she needs money to pay for medicine for her prematurely overweight son, Diabito.
Mama, may I have cookie?
No, Diabito. Roll back to kitchen.
Oh.
Effectively, no matter what you do, the moment you get medication like insulin, which is a protein, and it makes its way to your stomach, what you're going to have happen is the not only the enzymes, particularly peptidases, but also the hydrochloric acid that makes the stomach acidic, will break down insulin and make it no longer useful. Now, assuming that for whatever reason you, let's say that you opted for some sort of enteric coating, meaning it could travel through the stomach into the small intestine, and it would now theoretically work. Well, no, because the small intestine still has enzymes that break down proteins. Admittedly, not quite so well, but it will break it down, along with being relatively alkali, meaning that you need to do a lot of asking around to make it so that any medication would survive long enough to be absorbed, and then hope that it doesn't get broken down in the bloodstream. And so now you end up in a situation where you have a wildly unpredictable dose of insulin, meaning you could go from having, say, a perfectly adequate amount where your blood glucose levels are normal to having way too much, and so now you're hypoglycemic and possibly going to die from ketoacidosis, or hyperglycemic, in which case you now have way too much blood sugar and you're in a world of hurt.
Hi, I'm Wilford Brimley, and I have diabetes. It hurts me to pee, and it causes me to be short with my family. I can't sleep at night. The other day, I stubbed my toe and took it out on the dog. And 2 weeks ago, I ran out of vanilla ice cream and struck my wife. And then I find out my wife's been dead for 6 years. Who the hell did I hit?
This message brought to you by the National Diabetes Association.
This is why oral medications have not been successful yet. But apparently, a dose of 25 milligrams once daily apparently leads to what they describe as a relevant reduction in body weight, which is essentially saying, well, the average person got a benefit out of this. Yeah, okay. Their claim is that, the treatment group, let's call it, had a 13.5% decrease versus 11.5% decrease for the placebo. So taking oral semaglutide is apparently 2% better than doing nothing at all. Yeah, that's not a huge decrease. And we would argue that this is probably not necessarily going to go anywhere, particularly if, well, the results are as, let's say, wild as they appear. Remember this, that 2% improvement over the placebo is great, but that's the average. A third of participants lost more than 20% of their body weight whilst on this treatment. That means you have at least 18% standard deviation between the average and the extreme group.
That's bait.
Yeah, it's not good. Really not good. It tells us that there are a whole raft of underlying issues that need to be addressed. More than likely the fact that the chair the person sits on and the fridge are in too great proximity, but there may be other more, let's say, clinically relevant complications, such as interactions between medications, absorption in the GI tract. There may be issues around the actual availability in terms of how much it actually gets absorbed. There may be concerns about the differences in genes and activity of genes within individuals. So obviously, this is the lowest end of the dose spectrum that's been trialed so far, and it works extremely well for some people, but it is also only a temporary measure. A temporary in that the moment they stop doing this particular treatment pathway, they're going to put the weight back on. In news that you may not be able to do much about just yet is that bacteria in your mouth could be playing a major role in having a heart attack.
More. Thank you.
Now, this sounds terrifying, and to be blunt, it's somewhat is, but that also assumes that the results they found can be actually addressed and have any more significance than just, well, we found an association. The Finnish study looked at arterial plaques collected from 200 patients with what is called coronary artery disease. That is atherosclerosis, plaques in your arteries. The research at Tampere University of Finland found that a rather high percentage of these plaques contained oral bacteria. Now, this somewhat makes sense. It actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it to an extent. The plaques, the way they work, are made up of not only obviously the fats involved in making them, but also a whole bunch of macrophages or similar. These are the white blood cells that take up or phagocytize the foreign matter. Now, this foreign matter can include the lipids that make up the plaque, or anything else that they think is not meant to be there, including bacteria. Now, the amount of bacteria they would find at any given time is going to be relevant to this, and it would indicate that, well, those plaques, if they break free, would not just break free and therefore allow a relatively large solid mass to travel around your arterial system until it finds a constriction and blocks blood flow, an occlusion, but also that, well, obviously anything that's in there would also be part of that blockage, including, rather obviously, those macrophages full of those bacteria and lipids. It's important for us to point out that there were 200 patients that they, let's say, received samples from, and of those, 121 had died, and 96 had undergone surgery to remove the plaque from their blood vessels. So this means that you have a number of variables that are kind of important in this. The simple reality is that the moment you start poking around in someone's body, you have a good chance of introducing foreign organisms. In this case, obviously bacteria. If we are going to look at this more generously though, about 42% of all the plaques contained a variant, let's call it, of the Viridian streptococci group, and about 42%, nearly 43%, were present in the patients who died. So there is a small increase in the number of patients who died who had this particular bacteria, but to be blunt about it, it doesn't appear to be a statistically significant increase. The claim is that the presence of this bacteria was strongly correlated with both severe atherosclerosis and death from heart attacks and heart disease. We would argue that the inverse could also be true, that is, the factors that led to the increase in this bacteria and the plaques are what lead to the increase in the viridians. That is, specifically, if you have a really shit diet and you spend all your time eating burgers from McDonald's, or in case of Finland, whatever their weird fermented fish is, that would be why you have a mouthful of this bacteria. And so the correlation does not equal causation argument does apply here. It doesn't necessarily mean that it indicates nothing, it just indicates that there is substantially more that needs to be looked at before this can mean anything. Now for some older news, although more than likely still current, on parents who are arguably trying to do the right thing by their kids, medically speaking, but also probably screwing them in a very serious way. Parents giving their kids human growth hormone to make them taller. Yes, you did hear that correctly. Parents are effectively dosing their children with hormones to make them bigger, and typically taller, although there is a couple of caveats to that.
I'm in danger!
What we have here is, parents being given 3 to 5 years of treatment for their kids at the cost of $300,000 and sometimes more, so that their kids can gain an extra 3.5 to 7.5 centimeters. This is about 1.5 to 3 inches.
That doesn't seem right. Wait! Nappa! What? I had the scouter upside down. It's over 9,000.
Understand, no matter how much human growth hormone you give a kid, they are never going to be able to reach up and change a light bulb without having to get something to stand on. It's just not going to happen at this point. Although we assume that they're not doing that. It could be that they're trying to get their kid into the NBA or similar, but again, plenty of issues with that as well. And of course, this, let's call it a treatment, is, to be blunt about it, not without its huge risks, and we mean very big risks, or should we say tall risks. The issue with being tall is that the bigger you are, the more your heart has to work to supply blood to your body. The human growth hormone doesn't really increase the size of the heart. That remains relatively static. As a result, just about every individual who has been close to being a giant in real life has always suffered significantly from various cardiovascular diseases, and eventually died from something to do with their heart. There's also the issue that these same giant individuals had ongoing and serious issues with their joints, that they had various other health issues directly related to the fact that they were giants, and so on. Now, that is a case of gigantism, which is a medical condition, but it doesn't mean that you wouldn't see a more mild version of these various conditions in children who have been given human growth hormone, exogenous human growth hormone, in order to get them to be taller. So, yeah, that's not going to happen. This is supported by at least some, we wouldn't necessarily say preliminary, as it's not exactly preliminary, but limited research into this out of France, in that 7,000 people who had received the treatment between the ages of 10 and 16 had a notable increase in all-cause mortality compared to those who didn't. And, as mentioned, most of these deaths were due to heart disease and similar. So, yeah, giving human growth hormone to kids who are healthy may make them a better candidate for the NBA, or possibly for joining the Potsdam Giants, but it also means that, you're probably going to have your kids dying earlier and possibly before you, which, depending on how you look at kids, may or may not be a good or bad thing. If they get into the NBA, you've just come into a huge windfall. But of course, you've had to spend however much trying to get them to be tall and successful. Is this how child beauty pageant parents work? This must be their mentality. Next we go on to research that's coming out of Denmark, and we have issues with it. Alrighty, let's go through this very slowly. It's research that tracked about 85,000 adults, and what they're claiming is that being too skinny is more dangerous for your health than being too big.
Thanks for helping me set up this jungle gym, guys. Lois says Stewie's been getting a little chunky.
Ugh, everybody's always commenting on my weight. This is why I almost died from anorexia. You look fat.
The answer to this is yes, and also no shit.
Everyone, I'd like to get started. I'd like to get. We're start. You know what? Maybe everyone should sit down.
Because any time you go with the extreme of being too small or too big in terms of BMI, you inherently generate health issues. We've just spoken about the issues to do with atherosclerotic plaques and the fact that they cause blockages, but also the inverse is true. If you don't eat enough food, and therefore try to lose weight that way, you will develop issues around things like having dietary insufficiencies. You may not get enough vitamins, you may not get enough minerals. There are all sorts of things that can come about from not eating enough, or at least enough diversity of food. That's why, surprisingly, vegans have a surprisingly high rate of certain insufficiencies in their diet, and to a lesser extent vegetarians too, but they tend to be more resilient to these problems, let's say. But having followed so many individuals, well, again, this is no bloody surprise. The reality is that, again, any extreme is bad. What they found was what's called a bathtub curve, or a U-shaped curve, when looking at mortality and BMI, which, again, no surprise. Although we are more surprised by some of the diagnoses that came about. For example, diabetes was associated with being underweight, which kind of makes sense in ways, although we're assuming type 2 here, that death was somewhat more, let's say, more significant if you are smaller compared to if you are relatively normal weighted, normal being somewhere in the range of about 22 to 25 BMI, and of course, well, there are a bunch of other issues. We're not going to go through everything here. It's not worth it, because most of this is a no shit statement, and you're probably screaming at it going, yes, of course that's what's happening. It is worth us pointing out that, typically speaking, if you were to take the average number of people who are underweight and the average number of people who are overweight, you would find that the majority of individuals who are overweight vastly outweigh the number of individuals who are underweight. As a result, you can make a solid argument that we should invest in trying to prevent people from being underweight, and that's simply, well, partly good common sense, partly the fact that a lot of these people are underweight not because they want to be underweight, but because they can't afford food, and partly because there are various underlying psychological issues that will have further ramifications than just being at higher risk of health issues. But on the other hand, people who are overweight tend to stay in the medical system and continue to draw on the medical system, eventually leading to them dying, slowly but surely, being a problem the entire time. So it's not like either of these are good. But you would arguably get more benefit for the money spent on obesity than you do out of underweight individuals. But nonetheless, the research at least indicates that yes, there is more going on than just fat people are unhealthy. It's just a very simplification of the most common problem encountered. And then we have claims now that CT scans are linked with an increased risk of birth defects, which, given the nature of media and particularly news headlines, this has probably been everywhere. So, if we look at the study, okay, cool, 5 million women over 30 years, so this would indicate that we have lots and lots of data to run with. Second is that it's based out of Ontario, Canada, between 1992 and 2023. So, this so far sounds good. although there is a slight caveat to this, that roughly speaking there's about a 60-odd%, let's say, live birth rate for these roughly 5 million pregnancies. So this does indicate that there's something going on. The what they call spontaneous pregnancy loss and congenital anomalies were found for those who had had more CT scans prior to conception. Now, we're wondering right away if this is putting the cart before the horse. That is, was the increased rate of CT scans done because of, to be blunt about it, underlying health issues, and therefore there was always a higher risk of spontaneous pregnancy loss, or is this going to be a case of the CT scan actually plays a role? If we look at the claimed effect, the CT scans had an increased risk of pregnancy loss by about 8%, or at least if you had one scan. 2 scans 14%, and 3 or more scans increased that to about 19%. Congenital anomalies, 6% for 1 scan, 11% for 2, and 15% for 3 or more scans. So again, this sounds all kinds of terrifying. But then again, remembering that increasing on the base risk is still a relative increase. So if, for the sake of argument, you had a 1% risk to start with, well, now you at worst you have a 1.15% risk. Your increase was 0.15%. And so that increase, if you want to call it that, is obviously going to be very much relative. And we need to point out that relative risk is the important thing here. We'd also make the argument that the actual part of your body scanned appeared to have no effect on your increased risk, which is something of a red flag. That is, if you went in to, say, get your arms scanned for something, or your legs, absolutely nothing to do with the reproductive system, it seems like apparently that still increases your risk of these birth defects or anomalies and the obvious loss of pregnancy, which doesn't make sense immediately, because if you're scanning an arm, the arm has nothing to do with reproduction and yet it still affects it. This tells us that the underlying issue doesn't appear to be the CT scan itself, it's something far more fundamental to the individual. In other health-related news that could be causing harm, we have daylight savings. Daylight savings is that massive pain in the ass event that occurs twice a year, once when it kicks in and once when it's taken off.
8:58. First time I've ever been early for work. Except for all those daylight savings days, lousy farmers.
You either gain an hour or you lose an hour twice a year, and unfortunately, that really does disrupt the internal circadian rhythm of the human body. Suddenly waking up an hour earlier or an hour later than you had planned to has all sorts of issues to do with your health, and we would argue just simply being annoyed to hell by the idea that you suddenly lost an hour of sleep or had woken up an hour later than you planned to is really frustrating. The other concern is that apparently it does have more ramification when it comes to light exposure. That is, because you now shift the actual times you are active around by an hour, but your body doesn't make this change, if not immediately at all, your body is now able to respond to stimulation from the sunlight, mostly, the same way it should. And so you basically have all kinds of issues to do with your body going, okay, this is not the right time for this. What are you doing? Why are you up now? Or in other cases, you should be asleep now. Why are you still up? Or why aren't you up when you should be up? It's really disruptive to the human body. In other light-related news and the human body, researchers are claiming that we emit a visible light that will vanish when we die. Yeah, this sounds like nonsense, but...
Look, there it is. I'm so sorry I doubted you. I bring you love. Is that the love between a man and a woman, or the love of a man for a fine Cuban cigar? I bring you love. It's bringing love. Don't let it get away. Break its legs. Hello, children.
Hey, maybe we can give them the benefit of the doubt. It does come from the University of Calgary, and, well, they're not exactly a crazy institute most of the time, so maybe there's something to it. We would first immediately, and certainly without any other information, assume that they're talking about something like The basic idea of every chemical reaction generates some kind of energy and that some of that energy will eventually lead to the production of a photon seems like it would make sense. Now, these are what are called biophotons, and so we kind of understand why once you die, you would stop emitting these because your body sort of stops the majority of chemical processes. Now, understand, we aren't saying all processes, as things like, say, the ATP cycle still keep working for quite a while. There is still glucose available. Glucose gets turned into ATP eventually, and as long as that's available, that reaction keeps going on. And as long as I can keep powering other reactions in the body, the cells will keep doing what cells do. So, this sounds like, yeah, okay, it might make sense. It's the visible wavelength of light that we're not quite so sure about. So, we look at the research itself to figure out what's going on. And they describe this as an ultra-weak photon emission. So, again, kind of makes sense. Everything lines up so far. The actual, the reasoning they provide is that there is what can be best described as reactive oxygen species that living cells produce, and, well, this occurs, for example, when you get stressed, when you, consume anything that's going to cause you disruption, such as a Taco Bell, and you end up with the taco shits from hell, and so on. So, they looked at what happens with mice in particular when they are, first of all, in a dark box, and for some reason they felt the need to euthanize them. Like, okay, they kind of had to figure this out. But still, surely there are, easier ways to figure this out. The research was then replicated using a variety of other organisms. For example, they used certain plants and figuring out, do these things glow when they're alive? And yes. They then tried to stress the plant, and again, they saw the same thing. So essentially, if you are healthy, you shouldn't be glowing. And this is literally what should be happening given the nature of what it is. Apparently stress is what causes you to glow. And if you are unhealthy, you light up like a Christmas tree. In other health-related news, or this time shifting to other animals that are slightly more terrifying, we have a moose, and particularly Canadian moose. What is the plural of a moose? Is it a mooses? Anyway, the moose has a fairly major problem. In fact, it's a problem that will likely become a problem for America now. What it is that it has an actual brainworm. Not the kind that R.F. Cray Cray had, as that's both imaginary and crazy. No, we mean an actual brainworm that you can find in its eye. The brainworm, and particularly the moose carrying it, are also moving south across the border. The illegal Canadian immigrants are bringing with themselves disease. The brainworm is a form of nematode, and it infects a wide range of creatures. It's essentially parasitic. And unfortunately, because of what it does, eating through the brain of the host animal eventually just wanders its happy little ass out somewhere that it shouldn't be, mostly the road in this case, where said moose encounters a very large, very fast-moving, mostly metal object in the form of a car, and this leads to the sudden and rather unexpected demise of said moose and possibly the occupants of said vehicle. And so we now have to ask what's going on and can we actually stop it from spreading? It's not so easy to stop the spread of this particularly parasitic nematode. What we need to worry about is that there are a variety of hosts that are considered atypical. Now, that is something other than the white-tailed deer. These include, obviously, moose, elk, various camels, small ruminants, horses. You get the idea. The atypical hosts will poop on the ground, shedding their feces, carrying the disease. This will then lead to the grass growing with this said parasitic nematode, which then infects its intended host, who then poops and leads to more grass and snails, which then in turn infect new hosts, and not necessarily the definitive host. So it's very hard to get rid of the wild reservoir of this, because, well, we can't go out and cull every white-tailed deer out there. Admittedly, they tried with Bambi, but, Bambi led to it becoming rather frowned upon. This leads to the next best option. Identify those animals that are carrying it and provide them with a kind of treatment, and that seems to be the only way to really control it. And unfortunately, it's not easy to do, because once an animal is visibly sick with this nematode, well, it is too late. They got brain damage, and unfortunately, we only have two options. Euthanize them, or make them into the Health and Human Services Secretary. And having a elk in this case, or moose, or something similar, or even a deer, become the Health and Human Services Secretary really gives crazy Roman vibes, unfortunately. It's been a while since we've allowed an animal to be in charge of anything, and, well, last time it did, the barbarians invaded and sacked Rome, so probably not the greatest idea. The only way then to deal with this is serum testing. That is, take blood from the animal, more than likely dead at that point in time, after being hit by a large metal object, send it off to get tested, and now you get a map of where this disease is spreading, or more accurately to say the nematode is spreading, and then figure out, okay, do we need to cordon this off, do we need to quarantine areas, or what do we actually do? And, well, the easiest method will literally just be increased licensing to hunt, for example, white-tailed deer, to cull the population and thereby spread, more accurately stop the spread of the nematode. And now we go to deep-sea creatures that are really kinky. Ghost sharks that live in the deep sea, and literally we're talking about the deepest, darkest depths, use the teeth on their forehead during sex. Now, we won't judge you if you happen to be somewhat of the biting kind, but there's a big difference between biting during coitus and having teeth on your forehead. That's a very big difference. Now, the strange, bizarre creatures use what is called a retractable stalk. This is a tentacle, and, well, it's because they're a chimera. Not the kind of chimera that says Edward. No, instead, here we're talking about the kind of chimera that's a weird amalgamation of, well, sort of, well, no, actually, it's probably close enough to the kind that says Edward. It's that they've got bizarre appendages that extend from the male's forehead, and what they do is they act as a kind of, well, a trap, let's say. What they do is they grab onto the pectoral fins of the female counterpart during copulation, and they prevent them from drifting away. We think there's another word for this, but YouTube frowns upon it, so let's just say that they're a little bit more feisty. And so the animals have received both their nickname and also, well, yeah. The other thing to note is that this is a sort of evolutionary adaptation. That is, the creature itself originally involved with the kind of bizarre teeth for another purpose, that is typically feeding, and, well, has now used their particularly bizarre appendage, let's call it, to try and, well, use it more, different purpose, let's call it, again, for YouTube's sake. Next we have what is a very recent thing we've come across, purely because, well, X has some bizarre things now, in that there is a volcano snail that both eats and is partially made up of iron. Now, this does slightly overstate exactly what's going on, but it's not to say that they're entirely wrong in their description. This weird deep-sea snail is, well, obviously a deep-sea snail, but it lives near hydrothermal vents, and as a result, it feeds on the various products available there. The important thing here is that its bizarre phenomena, particularly its bizarre location, allows it to feed on a variety of products that otherwise might not be available. For example, iron sulfides. This means that the outermost layer of their shell is able to be made up of at least partially iron. More interesting, though, is that the foot is also partially armored with the same iron mineral. This means that the entirety of it essentially has armor on its side and its bottom, along with its top. There also appears to be a certain amount of adaptation in terms of its evolution to more efficiently allow for the absorption of this iron and various other products. So we have now literally armored tank-like snails that move at the speed of a World War I tank, if not possibly faster again. In other news, we have Italian sharks that continue to give virgin birth.
Fear not, pretty lady who ain't never had no relations. I's been sent to bring you the message that tonight you's gonna be getting pregnant with the Son of God. It's a miracle, yay!
I am?
Yeah, and he's gonna be here soon, so you might want to spruce yourself up. Maybe walk in the creek a little bit. Oh, and he probably don't want me to tell you this, but be ready, 'cause he might give you a little bit of a donkey punch.
So you're saying God got you pregnant?
Yes, Joseph. Glory in the highest.
Well, if it is his will, then his will be done, and I am but his humble servant. But I do have one question. Was he bigger than me?
Joseph, it wasn't like that. I felt nothing.
Oh, little guy.
Now, we just assume at this point that God has given up on humanity and is trying to send us a message that we are no longer the chosen peoples, because he's saying, look, I've made a new Jesus. Okay, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but still, there are a number of female sharks in this particular facility that are given birth asexually. This is not a unique phenomenon. Sharks have been known to do this for a very long time now. There have been reports going back an incredibly long way, and as a result, the, obviously, virgin birth is not actually a virgin birth. As a result, well, it's a form of asexual reproduction. And it's curious because, well, obviously, weird reproduction practices and people like learning about sex, or watching sex, or having sex, just sex in general, it seems. And so, we just mentioned this because, although, yes, the report we refer you to, article, let's call it, is somewhat older now, it's not like this is a thing that's just happened once. It keeps happening, and happening, and happening again. So if you're curious, you'll find the link below. The last news item we have for you this week is about the awards for the IgNobel Prizes. The 2025's IgNobel Prizes are not necessarily that exciting, although some of them are interesting. What they are, though, is essentially a satirical counterpart to the Nobel Prize. It's research that is being done that really doesn't go anywhere, for lack of a better way of putting it. It's quirky science that will make people laugh, and then think deeply about why though. And true, with some of these things, it does actually make a lot of sense that the research itself doesn't seem like it will go anywhere in and of itself, but what it finds can be useful in other ways and places. And some of the examples we have are exactly that. It's not necessarily useful by itself, but depending on how that information is used, could be very compelling. The first example is for physics, where the group of researchers were looking into how to make the perfect cacio e pepe pasta. This is a dish that's made by taking the starchy water from making pasta or cooking pasta and combining it with other ingredients, mostly cheese, and thereby creating a very cheesy, very rich pasta, but not one that breaks down into clumps. And how do you go about doing this? Now, by itself, the research isn't necessarily all that useful. Sure, making a perfect dish is always nice, and obviously makes it much more edible. But instead, it's the how do you use the emulsification research. Japanese research looked at whether or not you can spray paint cows to make them less attractive to flies, and this is something we've mentioned ourselves. We then have, what kind of pizza do lizards prefer to eat? Which is part of the nutrition category, and apparently 4 cheese pizza is the go-to option if you're trying to bait lizards into doing whatever it is you want. And finally, we have, the effect of foul-smelling shoes and someone's experience using a shoe rack, which, that one we're not quite sure how to justify as being worthwhile somewhere later on, but there must be some use. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, and please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.